My name is Haley Reed. I'm 34 years old, and for the last 13 years, I've lived a life that looks nothing like the commercials. There were no chaotic family dinners where everyone talks over each other, no lively group chats buzzing on my phone during the day, and absolutely no surprise visits. I learned very early on that for me, quiet was always safer than chaos, and work was a hell of a lot easier to understand than people. I run a late-night dessert business out of an industrial kitchen on the east side of Denver. It's not a cute storefront with pastel awnings. It's stainless steel, concrete floors, and the smell of huge quantities of sugar and butter caramelizing under fluorescent lights. I make cakes, bars, intricate pastries, whatever keeps the lights on and keeps my mind steady. Before I tell you what happened last month, I want to know where you are right now. What time is it for you? Are you watching this late at night when the house is finally quiet? Or is this your background noise while you get ready for the day? Let me know down below. It's always strange and kind of comforting to see how far these stories travel. For a decade, my business was just enough. It paid my rent on a tiny apartment, bought my groceries, and allowed me to save a little bit every month. It was a predictable, safe grind. But last month something shifted. The business didn't just grow. It exploded in a way I honestly never expected or prepared for. It started with a few corporate contracts that seemed too good to be true. Then suddenly a regional coffee shop chain wanted my bars in 50 locations. The orders jumped from dozens to thousands. I spent weeks just staring at spreadsheets, convinced I'd made a math error. But the numbers were real. Suddenly, they were saying something I had never allowed myself to say out loud. I didn't have to live small anymore. I could leave my tiny, cramped apartment behind. So I did something terrifying. I bought a house. It's bigger than anything I grew up in by a long shot, and honestly, bigger than anything a single person with a cat actually needs. It's a sprawling place on a quiet street, with a kitchen that felt like a promise the moment I walked into it. An island big enough to roll out dough for 100 tarts at once. It has rooms I still haven't decided how to use, empty spaces that echo when I walk through them. Moving day was surreal. I pulled up to this massive structure with nothing but a folding chair, a sleeping bag, a few boxes of clothes, and a container of leftover cupcakes from the previous night's shift. I sat in the middle of that empty living room floor as the sun went down, eating a slightly stale vanilla cupcake, just listening to the silence. It wasn't a lonely silence. Felt heavy but good. It felt like I had finally crossed some invisible line. I had stepped out of the shadow of the person I was forced to be when I was younger, and fully inhabited the person I had built, brick by brick, entirely on my own. For the first night in a very long time, everything felt still. My nervous system, which had been running on a low-level hum of anxiety for as long as I could remember, finally unclenched. And then the next morning happened. The past didn't just call. It arrived on my brand-new doorstep. Literally. I hadn't seen my mother or my younger sister in 13 years. Not a glimpse. But when I looked at the security camera feed, there they were, standing outside my new front door like the massive gap between us had just been a long weekend trip instead of more than a decade of total estrangement. They didn't just come for a visit. They had luggage stacked on the porch. They had a look of absolute expectation. They carried the kind of terrifying confidence people only have when they believe they still own a piece of you, regardless of how much time has passed. Seeing them on that small screen, standing on the porch of the sanctuary I had just bought for myself, made my blood run cold. It wasn't anger I felt first. It was pure, adrenaline-fueled panic. What happened when I cracked that door open is the whole reason I'm sitting here telling you this story today. Because sometimes, the hardest thing you'll ever have to do is protect the peace you've built. It is strange how early patterns settle into a family without anyone really noticing them until the concrete has already dried. For me, the dynamic began long before I understood the weight of being the oldest sibling. I didn't just grow up, I was drafted. I learned responsibility the way other kids learn musical instruments, through endless, daily repetition until it was just muscle memory. By the time I was 16, I wasn't thinking about prom or football games. I was picking up extra shifts at a local diner on the edge of town. I was barely old enough to drive the car that took me there, but I was already bringing home small, grease-stained paychecks. I'd cash them and immediately fill whatever gaps had appeared in the house that week. Groceries, a utility bill, gas for the car. No one ever explicitly asked me to do this. There was never a family meeting where we sat down and assigned roles. It was just understood. It was clear who was expected to fix things, and who was expected to study things. My younger sister, Maya, grew up under a completely different sky. Maya had a natural softness to her that adults constantly misread as innocence. She didn't have to explain herself because, usually, someone else stepped in to do it for her before she could even open her mouth. If she scraped her knee, she earned immediate sympathy and a bandage. If she missed a homework assignment, she earned excuses about how overwhelmed she was. If she made a poor choice, she earned comfort. I watched this pattern develop from the background, a place I stood in for so long it became the only view I knew. My mother carried a constant, vibrating worry that settled on Maya like a heavy blanket. If Maya was tired, we all lowered our voices to whispers. If Maya was stressed about a test, we cancelled our plans to help her study. If Maya cried, the entire household reorganized itself around the sound of her distress. I want to be clear, I didn't resent her at the time. I really didn't. I simply adapted. That's what children do. They survive the climate they are born into. I handled the rides, the chores, the errands, the emotional heavy lifting. I did anything that kept the air in the house from cracking. I thought if I just worked hard enough I could keep everyone happy. But what I couldn't adapt to, and what eventually broke me, was the quiet shift in perception. It happened slowly, imperceptibly. It's like the way a table starts to lean after years of uneven pressure on one side. You don't notice the slant until you put a marble on it and watch it roll off. Suddenly, a missing wallet didn't mean we should look for it. It meant questions were directed at me first. Forgotten appointments became assumptions that I hadn't passed along the correct information to my mother. Even my attempts to clarify small misunderstandings were met with a tightening expression on my mother's face. It was a specific look, pursed lips, tired eyes, that said I was complicating things, that I was being difficult. The moment that made everything crystal clear happened during a humid summer afternoon. Maya had misplaced a small amount of cash she'd set aside for a school trip. It wasn't a fortune, barely enough to cover a snack at a gas station stop. But the way she reacted changed more than just the atmosphere in the kitchen. It changed my life. She stood in front of our mother with tears gathering at the edges of her eyes, breathing unevenly, turning her palms upward as if asking the universe why it was conspiring against her. It was a performance of helplessness. I tried to explain that I hadn't touched her money. I offered to help look for it. But the room shifted. The tone wasn't angry. I could have handled anger. Anger you can fight against. This was worse. It was disappointed. It was a heavy, suffocating disappointment, as though I had failed some unspoken expectation of integrity. My mother looked at me and then at Maya and made a choice. She didn't need evidence. She chose the narrative that protected Maya's feelings. I realized then that explanations didn't matter in a house where feelings weighed more than facts. There was no malice in Maya's expression, which was almost the scariest part. It was just the subtle, terrifying confidence of someone who had learned that vulnerability was a kind of currency, and she was wealthy with it. After that day, the household adopted a rhythm I could not influence, no matter how hard I tried. If Maya had a late project, it was because I didn't remind her. If she missed the bus, it was because I took too long in the bathroom in the morning. If she seemed anxious, it was because I hadn't made her feel supported enough. Most of these judgments were unspoken, but unspoken things have a way of accumulating in the corners of a room like dust. I retreated into work because work offered clear rules. A shift started at a certain time, ended at a certain time, and effort had visible outcomes. If I scrubbed a counter, it was clean. If I served a customer, I got a tip. Home offered none of that logic. Any attempt to correct a false assumption only tightened the dynamic further. If I defended myself, I was being defensive. If I stayed silent, I was admitting guilt. So I learned to let silence carry the burden. The less I resisted, the smoother things ran. That was the true beginning of the distance between us. Not the dramatic kind of distance that appears in a single explosive argument, but the quiet, creeping kind that grows in the corners of a house where no one is looking. The kind you don't realize is happening until it becomes the only language the family speaks. And eventually, that language shaped everything that came after. There comes a specific point in everyone's life when a pattern stops being invisible and becomes a physical weight you can no longer carry. You don't always know you're at that limit until you cross it. For me, that moment arrived on a biting cold Tuesday morning when the balance in our house finally tipped in a way I knew I could never correct. I had agreed to lend my old sedan to Maya so she could run a small errand before school. It was a favor I had done a dozen times before. My car wasn't anything special, just a reliable beat-up thing that smelled like old coffee and vanilla air freshener, but it was the first thing I had ever owned completely. It represented my freedom. It wasn't the first time she had used it, but it was certainly the first time she returned it with the front bumper dented inward and a long, jagged scrape dragging across the passenger side paint. I was in the kitchen when I heard the front door open. I expected the jingle of keys, maybe a quick thanks shouted down the hall. Instead, there was a heavy, suffocating silence. When Maya walked into the kitchen, she was already trembling. She was clutching her coat tightly around herself, her knuckles white, holding her body in a way that suggested something terrible had happened to her, rather than her doing something to the car. She looked fragile. She looked devastated. By the time I wiped my hands on a towel and turned around, the story had already solidified in the room. It wasn't detailed in the traditional sense. There were no diagrams of the accident, no insurance information exchanged. But it was shaped to fit the emotional logic everyone in that house had come to expect from her. My mother was already there, her hand on Maya's shoulder, soothing her. When she looked up at me, I heard my name spoken in a tone that suggested I was responsible for circumstances I had never even touched. "Haley," she said, her voice sharp with worry. "Not for my property but for Maya's distress. Why would you let her take the car if the brakes were acting up?" Froze. The brakes weren't acting up. I had just had the car serviced. But looking at them, Maya weeping silently, my mother glaring at me as if I had sent her child into a war zone with faulty equipment, I realized there was no room for questions. There was no space for clarity. The conclusion had been drawn before I had even entered the room. I stood there, looking from the dented bumper visible through the window to the scene in my kitchen, realizing that the truth didn't have a place in the version of events they had already accepted. If I argued, I was attacking a crying girl. If I showed proof of the recent mechanic visit, I was being cold and unfeeling. That morning was the end, even if I didn't pack my bags that same day. After that, a shift began in small but decisive ways. It wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was a slow erosion. Holidays passed without my input on the menu or the schedule. Plans formed, gatherings happened, and dinners were cooked that somehow never included me. I wasn't pushed out with force. No one slammed a door in my face. I simply drifted out because the door kept moving just barely beyond where I could reach. I tried to hold on for a while. I really did. Every time I sensed the distance growing, I would try to bridge it. But every attempt to explain myself, or to set the record straight on small things, only made the distance more pronounced. It was like struggling in quicksand. The more I fought to be understood, the deeper I sank into the role of the difficult one. Eventually I stopped trying. I packed what I owned, which wasn't much, mostly clothes and baking equipment, and I moved into a studio apartment across town. It was a tiny box of a room above a noisy street, but the air inside it belonged to me. I naively thought leaving would give us space to reset. I thought that maybe, without the daily friction, the dynamic would heal. I thought time apart would bring clarity, that they would see how much I actually did for them once I wasn't there to do it. But distance only made the assumptions more rigid. Instead of realizing my value, they rewrote my history. I became the sister who pulled away. I became the daughter who made things complicated and then abandoned the family. I became the person who chose her own life at the expense of everyone else's comfort. None of these ideas matched the truth. But truth had stopped being a shared language between us a long time ago. In our family, truth was just whatever story caused the least amount of pain to the person crying the loudest. And I had never learned how to cry loud enough to be heard. 13 years is a lifetime. It's a long time to live outside the orbit of people who once defined your entire world. It's long enough for cells to regenerate, for cities to change skylines, and for a person to forget the sound of their own mother's voice. During those years, I didn't have the luxury of pondering the philosophical weight of estrangement. I was too busy surviving. I worked whatever jobs kept the rent paid and the lights on. I brewed coffee for commuters at dawn, wiped down tables in empty offices in the evenings, and learned how to mix batter in dark, rented kitchens when the rest of the city slept. Work made sense to me. It never pretended to be something it wasn't. A spreadsheet doesn't gaslight you. A convection oven doesn't interpret your temperature settings as a personal attack. Effort produced results, and those results kept me moving forward one day at a time. Meanwhile, while I was scraping by, Maya Reed was busy creating her own mythology online. I didn't see it at first. I wasn't connected to any of the family social media accounts. I had blocked them or they had blocked me. I couldn't even remember which came first. But the world is smaller than we think, and word travels, especially when the story is dramatic. I heard from old high school friends or distant cousins that she posted cryptic sentences about betrayal, healing, and finding strength when some people abandon you for their own comfort. She wrote about being left behind, about carrying emotional burdens alone, about loving people who didn't love her back. She curated a digital feed of beautiful, tragic resilience. She never wrote my name. She was too smart for that. But she didn't need to. Everyone following her knew exactly who she meant. I was the ghost in her machine, the villain in her hero's journey. It was strange, almost out of body, watching relatives attach themselves to her narrative from afar. I'd see screenshots sent to me by well-meaning acquaintances. They responded to her posts with prayer hands emojis, encouragement, and reminders that family should forgive. They reshared her posts and sent her long, public messages of support. It was clear they had built their own version of me, an unkind silhouette created from half-heard stories and assumptions that were easier to accept than the complex reality of a sister who just needed boundaries. They didn't know the person I was becoming. They only knew the character Maya had written for me. With each year that passed, the distance settled deeper, like sediment hardening into rock. Birthdays went unacknowledged. My mother changed her phone number without telling me. I found out when I tried to text her Happy Mother's Day one year and got a service undeliverable message back. Cousins married without inviting me, though I heard through the grapevine that I was mentioned in a speech as the sister who lost her way. I didn't correct any of it. There were nights I wanted to. Nights I sat in my studio apartment, furiously typing out emails I would never send, drafting posts I would never publish. I wanted to scream my side of the story. I wanted to show them the bank statements, the calendars, the truth. But I realized I didn't have the energy to rewrite stories that people didn't want rewritten. They were comfortable with their version. It gave them a common enemy and a reason to feel superior. So silence grew. It grew until it became its own environment, predictable, quiet, and strangely efficient. And within that silence, underneath the weight of being the family villain, I built the beginning of a life that belonged entirely to me. Growth rarely announces itself with a trumpet blast. It arrives in quiet increments that only make sense when you look backward. My own turning point started in the corner of a shared commercial kitchen I rented by the hour on the east side of Denver. I took the late-night slot, usually 1 a.m. to 5 a.m., partly because it was the cheapest rate they offered, and partly because no one else wanted to be there at that hour. Those hours gave me room to experiment. I could burn through batches of caramel without judgment. I could fail, tweak recipes, and learn without anyone watching over my shoulder. At first, my orders trickled in through text messages from coworkers at my day job and people they happened to know. "Hey, can you make 5 boxes of those chocolate chip cookies for my kids' party? Do you do gluten-free bars? 5 boxes 1 week, 7 the next." I measured my progress not by profit, but by the number of ingredients I had to restock at the wholesaler. I measured it by how many times the oven door gave off a wave of heat before dawn broke over the city skyline. It wasn't glamorous. My hands were always burned or cut, my back ached constantly, and I smelled permanently of vanilla extract. But it was steady. And after years of emotional chaos, steady felt like oxygen. The shift from hobby to business happened when a local office manager placed a bulk order for a corporate event. It wasn't massive by industry standards, but for me, it required preparing more than I had ever attempted in a single run. I spent that entire week whisking batter until my hands trembled, timing each tray with military precision, and labeling every box with a care that bordered on obsession. When the order was delivered, the feedback was immediate. The office called again the next month. Then again 2 weeks after that. Word traveled quickly through the networks of small companies that relied on catered treats to mark celebrations or soften long, boring meetings. Orders doubled, then tripled. I bought larger mixing bowls. I invested in sturdier, professional-grade containers. I bought a second set of heavy baking pans so I wouldn't waste precious minutes washing dishes between batches. I started tracking expenses and income in a black notebook I carried everywhere, calculating what I could reinvest, deciding when risk was acceptable. Eventually, the shared kitchen became insufficient. I was tripping over other bakers, fighting for fridge space. I needed more storage, more refrigeration, more space to move. Renting a dedicated kitchen space of my own was a massive financial stretch. It terrified me, but it was also the first decision that felt like a genuine act of faith in myself. The new kitchen was small and industrial, tucked between an auto repair shop and a dusty warehouse. It smelled faintly of metal and industrial detergent, but it was mine during the hours I rented it. That made all the difference. With more space came more orders. I added bars, cakes, and custom desserts to my menu. I organized deliveries with a schedule that required me to wake before sunrise, restock after midday, and work through evenings. For the first time in my life, exhaustion felt purposeful instead of draining. I saw numbers in my bank account that hinted at sustainability. It wasn't wealth, I wasn't buying sports cars, but it was stability. And stability was something I had never truly experienced before. When I hired my first part-time helper, the dynamic of my life shifted again. She was a quiet college student named Sarah who needed extra cash for textbooks. She didn't care about my life story, and I didn't burden her with it. She just wanted to know how I wanted the labels centered on the boxes and what time she could clock out. Giving up control of even the smallest task was terrifying at first. I hovered over her for the first week, watching her fold the cardboard boxes, waiting for a mistake. But she was efficient. She had a rhythm. And for the first time, the business no longer relied solely on my 2 hands. It had structure. It had a heartbeat separate from my own. I documented everything. Quantities, cost variations, customer preferences. I treated each batch of bars like a step forward on a staircase I was building in the dark. Even when a batch wasn't perfect, I logged it. I learned from it. The real turning point, the moment where the staircase finally led to a landing, came when a regional cafe chain reached out. They had tasted one of my dessert bars at a networking event I had forced myself to attend, standing in the corner, clutching a napkin, terrified to speak to anyone. But the product spoke for itself. They wanted weekly deliveries. Not just for one shop, but across several locations throughout the metro area. The scale of the request intimidated me. I remember sitting in my car after the meeting, gripping the steering wheel, my heart hammering against my ribs. I did the math on a napkin. It would require more ingredients than I had ever bought. It would require a schedule that was almost punishing. But I recognized the opportunity for what it was. A lifeline. After negotiating a schedule that wouldn't compromise the quality, because I refused to send out anything that tasted mass-produced, I signed the contract. That contract provided enough financial consistency for me to consider long-term plans I had never allowed myself to imagine. Before this, I planned my life in 2-week increments. Can I pay rent this month? Can I afford gas? Now I could look 6 months, even a year down the road. As the orders increased, so did the quiet understanding that my life was shifting into something firmer. Something with momentum. Saved carefully. I tracked profits obsessively. I reduced unnecessary expenses to the bone. I was still driving that same old car, wearing the same clothes, but my bank account was growing. Each month that passed brought me closer to stability, and stability eventually brought me to a place I hadn't expected. Homeownership. I wasn't looking for a mansion. I wasn't looking for status. I was looking for a fortress. When I toured the house I eventually purchased, I didn't see luxury, though it was certainly nicer than anywhere I had ever lived. I saw potential. I saw a kitchen with counter space wide enough to lay out multiple trays of cooling pastries. I saw a living room large enough for team gatherings, if I ever let people in close enough to gather. I saw rooms I could use for storage, for inventory, or just for quiet. Signing the closing papers felt surreal. It wasn't the feeling of, I made it. It was deeper than that. It was the feeling of, I survived it. It was the physical manifestation of every early morning, every burn mark on my arm, every lonely holiday I had spent working while the rest of the world celebrated. Stepping into that space after I got the keys, I understood that the life I had built no longer resembled the one I left behind 13 years ago. The house was on the east side of Denver, set back from the road. It had a heavy front door and big windows that let in the mountain light. I moved in with almost nothing. My furniture from the studio apartment looked ridiculous in the large rooms. A single folding chair in the middle of a dining room, a mattress on the floor of the master bedroom. But I loved it. I loved the echo. I loved that when I locked the door at night, the only breathing in the house was mine. For the first few weeks, I walked around touching the walls, as if checking that they were real. I organized the pantry with military precision. I set up my home office. I sat on the back porch with my coffee in the morning and watched the sun come up over a yard that I owned. It was peace. Absolute, unadulterated peace. I didn't have to worry about someone's mood shifting in the next room. I didn't have to walk on eggshells because someone had a bad day at school. The air in the house was neutral. It was mine to fill. But, as I said before, the past has a way of tracking you down, no matter how many heavy doors you put between you and it. The morning they arrived felt like a test I hadn't studied for. I had only been in the house a short time. I was still getting used to the silence that settled over the halls when the sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled me out of my routine. My driveway was long, and I wasn't expecting a delivery. I glanced at the security monitor I had installed in the kitchen, a habit from living alone for so long. Movement on the screen caught my attention. A car I didn't recognize was parked haphazardly near the garage. Then 2 figures stepped out. They moved with an ease that suggested familiarity rather than caution. One carried a suitcase. The other scanned the porch as if evaluating the property, assessing its value, deciding if it was up to her standards. I squinted at the screen, my brain refusing to process the visual information. It couldn't be. Simply couldn't be. But it was. Seeing them on my screen after 13 years felt like a hallucination. Maya Reed, my younger sister, moved with the same practiced confidence she had perfected long before adulthood. It was the kind of walk that came from believing rules applied to everyone except her. She wore oversized sunglasses and looked like she was arriving at a resort she had booked months in advance. Behind her stood Evelyn Reed, my mother. She was gripping her cardigan like she expected the house to welcome her back, staring up at the second-story windows. Neither looked uncertain. Neither hesitated. They didn't check their phones to see if they had the right address. They came as though responding to an invitation no one had sent. I didn't rush to the door. I didn't gasp. Froze. I watched them longer than necessary. I watched them walk up the path. I watched Maya reach out and touch the railing, claiming it. I watched my mother smooth her hair. I watched them and I recognized their posture. It was the shared assumption, the expectation that the years of distance would simply bend and break the moment I appeared. Something in me studied them. I wasn't the scared 16-year-old girl anymore. I wasn't the 20-year-old who ran away. I was a business owner. I was a homeowner. I was a woman who had navigated contracts and payroll and supply chains. I walked to the console table near the entryway. Days earlier I had prepared a folder. Sounds paranoid, I know. But when you grow up the way I did, you prepare for disaster the way other people prepare for rain. Picked it up. I felt its weight settle into my hand like a promise I had made to myself. I took a deep breath, unlocked the deadbolt, and opened the door. Opening it only slightly was a deliberate choice. I kept the gap narrow enough to maintain control, but wide enough to prevent any misunderstanding that I was hiding. They stood directly in front of me. Close enough that I could smell my mother's perfume, the same floral scent that used to give me headaches. Close enough to see the shine on Maya's freshly done nails and the faint irritation in my mother's expression that I had taken too long to answer. Neither of their faces matched the gravity of the years that had passed. They looked casual. Maya reached for her suitcase handle with casual certainty. She angled her body toward the threshold, shifting her weight forward, as if stepping inside was a formality she didn't need my permission for. My mother positioned herself slightly behind her, the way she used to whenever she expected me to comply without protest. For a moment the world hung suspended. They both waited for the version of me they had shaped, the silent, compliant girl, the one responsible for the comfort of everyone else. They waited for me to step back. They waited for me to apologize for the wait. They waited for me to take the suitcase. Instead I stayed still. The folder in my hand remained closed, but its presence created an invisible wall they hadn't anticipated. The dynamic shifted in the space of a heartbeat. Maya's confident posture faltered just enough for me to notice. Her foot, which had been hovering ready to take that first step inside, placed itself back on the porch concrete. My mother's expression hardened in a way I recognized instantly from years earlier. It was the manager look. The look she used when she believed obligation outweighed autonomy, when she felt her authority was being questioned. Holding my ground felt unfamiliar, but it also felt incredibly powerful. It wasn't a loud power. I didn't rely on raised voices. I didn't scream, "How dare you?" I didn't ask them why they were there. I didn't need to. Their luggage spoke for them. I let the boundaries speak for themselves. I placed the folder slightly forward. I wasn't offering it to them to hold. I was just bringing it into the visible space between us. I wasn't hiding it. I was simply acknowledging that it existed. Inside that folder was a guest license, a no trespass notice I had already notarized just in case, and a ledger. That ledger was a photocopy of a document I had kept for years, a detailed list of every expense I had covered, every debt that had been assigned to me, every manipulation that had slowly cut me out of the family narrative. These documents represented a version of myself that had finally learned to write things down instead of carrying them in silence. They were my shield. The air between us became heavier. The casual reunion vibe evaporated. Maya shifted her weight, recalculating the situation. Her eyes darted from my face to the folder, then to the narrow sliver of the interior she could see behind me. My mother's eyes moved from me to the folder, then to the narrow gap of the open door. I saw the realization dawn on her face, the sudden, jarring understanding that the home she assumed she could enter was no longer an extension of her authority. It was a foreign country, and she didn't have a visa. I felt no urgency to fill the silence. That was the biggest change. In the past I would have babbled. I would have offered water, tea, an apology for the awkwardness. I would have done anything to smooth the tension. Now, I let the tension sit there. It wasn't my responsibility to ease their discomfort. They had come to my house, uninvited, with luggage. The discomfort was theirs to carry. They waited for permission. I didn't give it. I didn't raise my voice or repeat what the documents already made clear. The boundary existed whether they accepted it or not. Eventually I stepped back. Not to invite them in. I stepped back to place the folder on the small console table behind me, just inside the door. I positioned it deliberately, squaring the edges with the table. It was a visual anchor, a reminder that every decision moving forward would be written, measured, and chosen by me alone. The moment held steady, unbroken. Each of us understood what the years apart had changed. I wasn't the daughter who needed their approval. I was the woman who owned the door. My mother opened her mouth to speak, likely to invoke family or duty, but something in my face stopped her. Maybe she saw the stranger in my eyes. Maybe she saw the business owner who negotiated contracts for a living. Maya looked at her suitcase, then back at me. For the first time she looked uncertain. The script she had been following, the one where she shows up and is embraced, had run out of pages. By the time I finally closed the door, I didn't slam it. I just closed it. Firmly. The click of the deadbolt sliding into place was the loudest sound in the world. The house felt different immediately. Not quieter. Quiet had been my normal for years, but defined. It felt as if the walls themselves understood the boundary I had drawn. The space behind me was safe. The space in front of the door was not. I stood there in the hallway longer than necessary, listening to the muffled sounds of them on the porch. I heard a car door slam. I heard an engine start. I let the adrenaline settle in my veins before I finally turned around and returned to the kitchen. It didn't take long for my phone to start vibrating. The timing was predictable, almost rehearsed. It's funny how trouble always travels through the same channels. The first alerts came from cousins I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Screenshots of social media posts appeared in rapid succession. I didn't open the messages, but the previews on my lock screen were enough to make their intent clear. Maya had wasted no time reshaping the narrative. Photos of my front porch, taken just minutes ago, were already online. They were paired with captions that framed her arrival as an act of desperate hope and my refusal as an act of calculated cruelty. Tried to reconnect today. One caption read, "Some doors are locked from the inside by pride." She understood the digital stage as well as she had understood our family's emotional landscape. She knew exactly what words to use to trigger sympathy. She positioned herself as the weary traveler turned away at the inn. Sympathy flowed toward her with familiar speed. I could see the comment count ticking up even from the notifications. I didn't respond. Engaging would have pulled me back into the script she had controlled for years. If I commented, I was defensive. If I argued, I was bitter. Instead, I opened my laptop. I sat at my kitchen island, the granite cool under my arms, and drafted a short email. I sent it to the relatives, still using the same email addresses I had on file from years ago. It wasn't an explanation. It wasn't a plea for them to understand my side. It was a boundary written plainly. "Communication is limited to email," I wrote. "There will be no discussions involving money or housing. No accusations. No emotional barbs. Anything outside these terms will be ignored." I didn't justify it. I didn't soften it with "I hope you understand" or "Love, Haley." I simply established the rules I should have set 13 years earlier. More messages came flooding in. A few relatives sent paragraphs accusing me of abandoning family values. Someone claimed I had forgotten where I came from, which was ironic, considering I remembered exactly where I came from, which is why I left. Another insisted I owed Maya an opportunity to get her life on track, as if I were a rehabilitation center and not her sister. The familiar tone of moral obligation echoed through each message. But this time it didn't shake me. They were recreating a play I no longer acted in. I was in the audience now, watching the drama unfold on a stage I had left behind. Not long after, my mother sent a single-line email. No greeting, no punctuation. Just the kind of message meant to provoke immediate, visceral guilt. "You've broken your sister's heart." It carried the same weight she had always relied on. Guilt disguised as concern. Obligation framed as morality. I closed the email without replying. Later that evening, when I saw her name appear again in my inbox, I felt nothing sharp. Just a quiet recognition of patterns she still believed could influence me. She wrote a longer message this time. She wrote about sacrifice. She wrote about raising 2 daughters alone. She wrote about all the times she felt unsupported. Every sentence pointed back to the same idea, that my stability, my house, my business, my peace, was something she deserved access to. And denying it was an act of betrayal. I let the message sit. No response would change her version of events. I had finally accepted that I wasn't responsible for correcting her narrative. I couldn't edit her reality. Instead, I drafted a separate document on my computer. One outlining the steps I would take if they continued to appear uninvited. It wasn't emotional. It was procedural. I listed contact information for a process server. I looked up references to local property laws. I wrote down instructions for maintaining records of harassment. Creating it felt like reinforcing a foundation I had long ignored. It wasn't about being litigious. It was about being prepared. It was about treating my safety with the same professionalism I treated my business contracts. The following morning arrived without the cinematic explosion I had half expected. I think deep down, when you grow up in a chaotic household, you're conditioned to believe that saying no will result in the sky falling. You expect the windows to shatter or the police to show up. But the sun just came up over the mountains like it always does. The coffee machine gurgled at 6 a.m. The house was still standing. However, the digital noise continued. It was like a low-frequency hum in the background of my life. Maya had moved on to the next phase of her cycle. She started posting vague statements about toxic relatives and protecting your peace, which was ironic given that she was the one currently trying to breach mine. She gathered sympathy from people who didn't know either of us, strangers who projected their own traumas onto her vague captions. I didn't check her profile directly. I knew better than that, but snippets reached me. Notifications from mutuals, forwarded messages from people who thought they were helping. Her pattern was so predictable it was almost boring. She would position herself as the wounded party, imply a great betrayal without giving specifics that could be fact-checked, and then wait for the validation to roll in. It had worked for her since adolescence. It got her out of trouble in high school, it got her extensions on deadlines, and it got her sympathy from every boyfriend she'd ever had. She saw no reason to stop using a tool that had never failed her. But here is the difference. I wasn't watching the performance anymore. I spent that entire day at my kitchen counter, not pacing or crying but working. I reviewed invoices for the upcoming month. I updated supply orders for flour and high-quality chocolate. I planned out the delivery routes for the drivers for the coming week. Work had always been my anchor, but now it served another function. It was proof. Every invoice I paid, every contract I reviewed, was physical evidence that my life no longer depended on the approval or involvement of the people who misunderstood me. I realized, as I sat there highlighting rows on a spreadsheet, that everything I had built existed completely outside their assumptions. My mortgage company didn't care if my mother was disappointed in me. My clients didn't care if my sister thought I was selfish. My reality was fortified by my own competence, and they couldn't touch that. As evening settled over the house, the light shifting from stark white to a warm, heavy gold, the air felt balanced again. It wasn't because the situation had magically resolved itself. My family was still out there, likely angry and spinning stories, but because I had reclaimed the space where their expectations used to live. I walked past the console table in the hallway. The folder of documents I had prepared, the process server info, the legal references, the log of events, remained untouched. I didn't move it. I left it right there. I didn't hope they would be unnecessary. Hope is a passive thing, and I was done being passive. Hope implies you're crossing your fingers and wishing for the best. This wasn't hope. It was preparation. It was knowing that if the storm came back, I had the shutters ready. Time has a funny way of testing boundaries long after the day you draw them. We tend to think the victory is the moment you close the door. But the real victory, the real test, comes in the quiet days that follow. For me, the real test came quietly, not in some dramatic confrontation, but in the way my life held its shape after I chose not to open that door. I woke up the next day and the day after that. Mornings still started with production lists. My staff still waited on clear instructions. The massive convection ovens still needed preheating. The mixers still needed scraping down. The bills still needed to be paid. Nothing collapsed. That was the revelation that changed everything for me. I stopped letting my family's chaos bleed into my schedule, and the world stayed upright. In fact, it spun a little smoother. There was no retribution from the universe for prioritizing my own sanity. The sky didn't darken. My business didn't fail because I was a bad sister. I think for a long time I carried a subconscious belief that I was the load-bearing wall for the entire family. That if I stepped away, they would crumble, and the guilt of that wreckage would destroy me. But standing in my kitchen days after turning them away, I realized two things. First, if they crumbled, it was because they hadn't built their own foundations. And second, and perhaps more importantly, I wasn't a load-bearing wall to them. I was just a crutch. And crutches are only useful if you're injured. If you use them when you can walk, they just make you weak. The quiet of the house ceased to feel empty and started to feel full. It was full of my choices. It was full of the life I had curated. I stopped jumping every time the phone rang. I stopped checking my email with a pit in my stomach. I started to trust the silence. I remember one specific afternoon, about a week after the incident. I was testing a new recipe for a lemon basil tart. The kitchen smelled like citrus and butter. Sunlight was hitting the floorboards in that perfect way that makes dust motes dance. I took a bite of the tart and it was perfect. Sharp, sweet, crumbling perfectly. And in that moment, eating a tart in a house I owned, paid for by a business I built, I felt a profound sense of release. I realized I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop anymore. I had thrown the shoes out. The documents on the table gathered a little dust, but they stayed there. A silent sentinel. A reminder that I wasn't helpless. I was just done participating in a game I never asked to play. The drama was happening, surely, but it was happening over there, far away from my front porch. And for the first time in 34 years, over there was exactly where it belonged. About 3 months after they had appeared on my porch, the noise around them finally began to fade. It didn't stop all at once like a light switch flipping off. It was more like a radio station driving out of range. The signal got weaker, the static took over, and eventually there was just silence. The frantic screenshots from relatives slowed to a trickle. I think they realized I wasn't going to give them the reaction they craved. Emotional vampires eventually get bored if you don't give them a vein to tap into. The posts that had been shared and reshared lost their momentum because there was no new content to fuel them. I hadn't fought back, I hadn't made a scene. And it's hard to keep a war going when only one side is shooting. Then an email from Maya arrived. My stomach tightened when I saw her name, a reflex I hadn't quite unlearned yet. But when I opened it, the message was short and strangely practical. The subject line didn't say, "Why do you hate me?" or "emergency." It just said, "work." The body of the message asked if I knew any places in the city that were hiring for flexible shifts. She mentioned she needed something that didn't require a degree. There were no accusations hiding between the lines. There were no attempts to reopen old wounds or guilt-trip me into sending cash. It was just a question. In the old days, the old Haley would have read that email and immediately spiraled into problem-solving mode. I would have offered her a job at my bakery. I would have driven her to interviews. I would have probably offered to pay her rent until she got on her feet. I would have tried to fix it. But I wasn't that person anymore. I knew that inviting her into my bakery would be a disaster. It would blur the lines I had just spent months drawing in permanent ink. So I replied. But I replied with boundaries. I sent her a simple bulleted list of temp agencies and local shops that I knew were hiring for the upcoming season. I didn't add a personal note. I didn't say, "I believe in you," or "good luck." I just provided the information she asked for, treating it like a query from a stranger on LinkedIn. Then, I returned to my spreadsheets without waiting to see what she did with that information. A few weeks later, another message appeared. This time there was no text at all. It was just a single photo attached to a blank email. Clicked on it. It was a selfie of Maya. She was standing in a break room somewhere, wearing a plain, slightly ill-fitting uniform polo shirt. A plastic employee badge was clipped to her collar. Behind her, the fluorescent lights cast that specific tired glow you only get in service jobs. She didn't look happy. She didn't look glamorous. She looked tired. But it was the first image I had seen of her in years where she wasn't framed as the center of a tragedy. She wasn't posing to look fragile. She was just a person at work. I saved the file to a folder on my computer and left it there. I didn't reply. I didn't treat it as proof that she had suddenly become a different person or that she was cured. I let it stand as quiet evidence that whatever changes she chose to make from that point on were her responsibility. They were not the result of me stepping in to rescue her. She was doing it or she wasn't. But I was just the observer. Around the 6-month mark, the contact from my mother changed too. She reached out again, but this time the message felt stripped of the performance. There were no guilt trips, no mentions of broken hearts. She simply asked if she could see the house. Just once. "I just want to see where you live," she wrote. I thought about it for 2 days. I weighed the risk. I consulted my own feelings, not my obligations. And I decided to say yes, but on my terms. I answered with clear parameters. Specific day. A specific time slot, 1 hour. And she had to come alone. No Maya. No surprise cousins. When she arrived, she walked through the front door with a careful, hesitant energy. It was the walk of someone moving through a museum where they are afraid to touch the exhibits. She walked through the living room, running her hand along the back of the sofa. She looked at the organized pantry, the lined-up baking trays in the kitchen, the absence of the clutter that had once swallowed every flat surface in the home we used to share. We sat at the kitchen table, the big one I had bought for future potlucks, and for a while we just sat. She commented on small, practical things. She noted the sturdiness of the chairs. She remarked on the depth of the sink, saying it must be good for washing big pots. Then she looked at the open shelving where I kept my dinnerware. "You have a lot of plates," she said quietly. "Enough for a full table." "I do," I said. She didn't ask who filled those seats. And I didn't offer the names of my friends or my staff. But the implication hung in the air. I had prepared a life for people who chose to be there. We didn't mention the years of silence. I didn't ask for explanations or apologies. We both understood, I think, that no combination of words could undo the pattern that had made me the problem and Maya the story. Those roles were too deeply written to be erased over a cup of tea. What we had instead was a brief moment of honest distance. We were two adults occupying separate lives, meeting in a place that belonged fully to one of us. When the hour was up, she didn't argue. She stood up, smoothed her coat, and walked to the door. Before she left, she paused with her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. She looked back at me, standing in the hallway of the house I had bought with money I had earned. It wasn't a look of pride exactly. It was more like recognition. It felt like a small, reluctant acknowledgement that whatever authority she once assumed she had over my space, and over me, had quietly expired. "It's a sturdy house, Haley," she said. "Yes," I replied. "It is." Left. And when I locked the door behind her, I didn't feel abandoned. Felt intact. Time did what it always does. It kept going. It doesn't care about family feuds or emotional breakthroughs. It just ticks forward. And honestly, there is a lot of comfort in that inevitable march. Nearly a year after I signed the closing papers on the house, I was standing in line at a grocery store when I ran into a mutual acquaintance. She was someone who knew the family but wasn't deep in the drama, the best kind of acquaintance. We were making small talk about the weather and the price of eggs when she dropped a piece of news casually, right between scanning her milk and her bread. She mentioned that Maya had been promoted to a shift supervisor position at the shop she was working at. I froze for a second, my hand hovering over my own cart. In the past, news about Maya usually came with a siren attached. It was always "Maya is in trouble," or "Maya quit," or "Maya needs bail money." But this was just a workplace update. It was mundane. It was normal. "She says it's exhausting," the acquaintance laughed. "But she likes the authority." Smiled. A real smile. "That sounds like her," I said. And it did. Maya always liked authority. She just used to wield it emotionally. Now she was wielding it professionally. Her online presence had changed too. Or so I was told. I still kept my distance, but the grapevine is persistent. I heard that the vague, poetic posts about betrayal and toxic bloodlines had started to disappear. The black and white photos of rain-streaked windows were replaced by tired jokes about customers, memes about caffeine addiction, and complaints about closing shifts. She was no longer performing the role of the tragic heroine for an audience of strangers. She was just living a life. It occurred to me that maybe, just maybe, when I refused to play the villain in her story, she was forced to write a new script. Without a bad sister to blame for her stagnation, she had to find a new source of friction. And in the absence of family drama, she found work. Whether her private narrative about me softened or hardened was something I chose not to monitor. It was no longer my job to track her version of events. I realized I didn't need to know if she forgave me. I didn't need to know if she still complained about me to her new co-workers. Her opinion of me was none of my business. Through all of this, I stayed resolutely outside their orbit. I didn't resume the role of the quiet fixer. I didn't become the financial backup plan. I didn't become the emotional sponge. On the rare occasions I chose to help, because they were still family and I am not made of stone, I did it the way I handle any business decision. Specifically, intentionally, and with ironclad limits. If there was a bill that absolutely needed to be covered for safety reasons, I didn't send cash. I got the account number and paid the utility company directly. I sent information that could be used or ignored. Job fairs, housing assistance links, tax resources, and nothing beyond that. I stopped asking, "Did you do it?" I stopped checking up on them. I provided the resource and walked away. It was a transaction of care, not a contract of obligation. This freed up an incredible amount of energy. And the rest of that energy went into the people standing directly in front of me now. My life began to populate with people who matched my new vibration. I focused on my employees, people who showed up at 4 a.m. because they took pride in their work, who told me the truth even when they made mistakes. I invested in neighbors who waved hello across the lawn and asked how I was doing without digging for gossip to trade later. And I found friends. Real friends. The kind of people who cared about my well-being without needing a common enemy to justify their loyalty. My house, the one that had felt so big and echoing in the beginning, gradually became a place for end-of-week potlucks. It started small. Just me and a couple of friends ordering pizza on the floor. Then it grew. We started hosting low-stakes game nights where the point wasn't to win, but to laugh until our sides hurt. My kitchen, once a fortress of solitude where I tested recipes in silence, became a hub of noise. There were nights when the island was covered in takeout boxes, half-finished pastries from the bakery, and bottles of wine. I would look around the room at these people who didn't know the old Haley, people who didn't know the family mythology, and I would feel a sense of belonging that terrified me in its intensity. The rooms that once echoed with absence were now filled with a kind of laughter that didn't require me to shrink. In my childhood home, laughter was often at someone's expense. It was a weapon used to minimize feelings or deflect tension. But here in my house, laughter was just joy. It was light. It didn't cost anything. I remember one specific night, sitting on my back porch with a friend, watching the fireflies in the yard. She turned to me and said, "You seem different than you did a year ago. You take up more space." She meant it physically. I wasn't hunching my shoulders anymore, but she meant it spiritually too. I wasn't making myself small to accommodate the chaos of others. I wasn't pre-apologizing for my existence. The folder of documents near the entryway, the one with the legal notices and the ledger, stayed where I had left it on the console table. Over time it got buried under mail, keys, and sunglasses. But knowing it was there didn't make me hard or cynical. Made me clear. It was my anchor. It reminded me that I had options. It reminded me that I wasn't trapped. I stopped rehearsing defenses in my head while I was in the shower. I stopped building imaginary courtrooms where I won arguments no one else would ever hear. I accepted that some people, my mother, my sister, maybe even some cousins, would always cling to a version of me that made their choices easier to live with. If painting me as the selfish deserter helped them sleep at night, then fine. Let them paint. My peace no longer depended on them updating that portrait. It depended on me refusing to trade my sanity for their proximity. I had built a new orbit, one with its own gravity, and for the first time I was the sun in my own solar system, not just a moon reflecting someone else's light. Looking back on all of this, the business, the house, the long silence, and that brief tense standoff in the hallway, I don't see any of it as a clever revenge arc. I know the internet loves a good revenge story. We love the moment where the underdog wins the lottery and rubs it in the faces of the people who doubted them. But that's a movie script, not a life. There was no cinematic moment where I won in a way that would satisfy a studio audience. I didn't bankrupt them. I didn't ruin their reputation. I didn't drive past them in a convertible laughing. What happened was quieter, and to me, infinitely more important. I simply stopped. I stopped letting other people's denial dictate the shape of my days. I stopped trying to explain color to people who were committed to seeing the world in black and white. Through this process, I learned the hardest lesson of my life, one that I want to share with you now because I have a feeling some of you need to hear it. I learned that love without boundaries is not generosity. It is erosion. For years I thought that if I just gave enough money, enough time, enough emotional bandwidth, it would prove how much I loved them. I thought being good meant being available to be consumed. But I wasn't being generous. I was being worn down like a stone on a shoreline, battered by wave after wave until I was smooth, small, and unrecognizable. Real love, healthy love, doesn't require you to disappear. It doesn't ask you to set yourself on fire just to keep someone else warm for 10 minutes. I also learned that being called selfish by people who benefit from your exhaustion is not a reliable measure of your worth. When my family called me selfish for not letting them move into my house, they weren't describing my character. They were describing their inconvenience. They were upset because the appliance they had relied on for years, me, had suddenly unplugged itself. That doesn't make the appliance broken. It makes it free. I realized that you can wish someone well without giving them a key to your front door. You can hope they find happiness without handing them access to your bank account or your nervous system. You can love them from a distance where you are safe, and that is still love. In fact, sometimes it is the most honest form of love there is because it is stripped of the transaction. If there is anything I hope you carry from this story, it isn't just about baking or buying a house. It is the simple, terrifying permission to close doors that only ever open to strip you of yourself. There might be someone watching this right now who is standing in their own version of that hallway. Maybe you're holding a phone, reading a text that makes your stomach turn. Maybe you're dreading a holiday dinner. Maybe you're wondering if you're a bad person for wanting to say, no. I am here to tell you that you are allowed to protect the life you built. You are allowed to enjoy the coffee you paid for. You are allowed to sit in a quiet room that you cleaned. You are allowed to succeed without apologizing for it. And you are allowed to keep the gate locked, even when the hands knocking on it feel familiar. Especially when they feel familiar. You are allowed to choose quiet, honest peace over a loud performance that keeps everyone else comfortable while you slowly disappear. The documents on my console table are still there, but I don't look at them as often. I don't need to. I know who I am now. I am Haley Reed. I make the best lemon bars in Denver. I own my house. And I own my peace. Thank you for staying with my story, wherever you are and whatever the clock looks like where you're watching from. I know this was a long one and I know it was heavy. If this stirred something in you about your own boundaries, or if it brought up memories you haven't looked at in a while, you can keep that reflection private. It's yours. But if you want to share it, if you want to leave a piece of your story here so others feel less alone, feel free to do so in the comments. This community we've built here is a safe place for that. However you decide to respond, I hope you remember that protecting yourself is not cruelty. It is the beginning of living in a way that finally makes sense. I'm going to go check on the ovens now. The timer is about to go off and I have a lot of work to do. But it's good work. And it's mine. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next one.